The United States government killed more than 10,000 of its own citizens during Prohibition. Not by accident, not through negligence, through a deliberate, documented policy, reviewed by chemists, approved by Treasury officials, and defended in writing after the bodies started showing up. The official story says people died because they drank illegal alcohol made by criminals in unsanitary conditions. That is true. It is also incomplete in a way that changes everything. The poison was not in the bootlegger's bathtub. It was in the federal formula. By 1927, a forensic pathologist named Charles Norris had the autopsy files, the chemical analysis, and the source documentation to prove it. He published the evidence. He sent it to the Treasury Department, the Prohibition Bureau, and the White House. In January 1927, the Bureau reviewed his findings. Then, expanded the formula. In Act 5, you'll see the specific memo, with the exact language the government used to justify adding more poison after the deaths became public. That language has never been retracted. It is in the National Archives right now, under your government's name. Every institutional scandal leaves a paper trail. This one left 11 compounds on a signed form. On December 26, 1926, the day after Christmas, 60 people were admitted to Bellevue Hospital in New York City in a single day. All of them were poisoned. Not by a contaminated food supply, not by a factory accident. By alcohol they had purchased and consumed the night before, the same way millions of Americans consumed alcohol every week during Prohibition. 8 of them died before midnight. The New York City Medical Examiner's Office opened each body. They found methanol, wood alcohol, at concentrations that should never exist in a drink. Methanol causes the optic nerve to die first. Victims went blind before they went into convulsions. Some of them knew what was happening to them. This was not a bad batch from a careless bootlegger. According to federal records held at the National Archives, specifically the records of the Prohibition Bureau under the Treasury Department, the methanol was there by design. The United States government had been adding it deliberately. The denaturation program had been running since 1906 under the Industrial Alcohol Act, but the Prohibition Bureau dramatically expanded the formula after 1920. The standard denaturing formula used by licensed industrial alcohol producers, companies that supplied hospitals, factories, and laboratories, was required by federal regulation to include, at minimum, methanol at 10 parts per hundred, plus a rotating cocktail of benzene, cadaverine, kerosene, and chloroform, depending on the batch specification. The reasoning was enforcement logic. Industrial alcohol was tax-exempt. It was everywhere. Without poisoning, bootleggers would simply divert it, redistill it, and sell it as drinking alcohol. The poison was meant to make diversion lethal, to make the cost of drinking illegal alcohol as high as possible. The Treasury Department knew the diversion was already happening at industrial scale. It knew people were drinking the denatured product. It raised the methanol requirement anyway. What happened at Bellevue on December 26th was not an exception. It was the system working exactly as designed. By the end of the 1926 holiday season, New York City alone had recorded 23 deaths from government formula alcohol in a single week. And then there's Charles Norris. The record is clear. What isn't clear is how long the record was buried. Prohibition was passed on January 17, 1920, with the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. The story most Americans know goes like this. A coalition of temperance activists, Protestant church groups, and progressive reformers convinced Congress that alcohol was destroying American families, American workers, and American productivity. The amendment passed. The country went dry. Bootleggers and gangsters filled the vacuum. Al Capone got rich. Speakeasies flourished. Eventually, the whole experiment collapsed, and the 21st Amendment repealed it in 1933. In this version of the story, the government is misguided but well-intentioned. Prohibition is a cautionary tale about idealism overreaching. The deaths that occurred were the consequence of a criminal underground the government was trying and failing to control. This is the version taught in schools. The evidence does not support it. What the evidence shows is a federal bureaucracy that made a specific, documented decision to use death as a deterrent, and then watched the death toll rise without reversing the policy. The Prohibition Bureau was not a law enforcement agency in any recognizable sense. It was chronically underfunded, riddled with corruption, and staffed by agents who were frequently on the payrolls of the bootleggers they were supposed to arrest. By 1925, the Bureau had fired more than 10,000 agents for corruption. That number is not a typo. The Bureau's actual power was not in its agents. It was in its chemistry lab. The formula approved by the Treasury Department on March 3, 1925, required industrial alcohol to contain a minimum of 4 denaturants simultaneously. That detail is buried in the Federal Register. In Act 4, it becomes the center of everything. What the official story needed, and what made Prohibition politically viable for 13 years, was a clean separation between the government and the consequences. The deaths were blamed on criminal bootleggers who sold dangerous product to people who were already breaking the law. The government was the victim of a law-breaking public. The public was the victim of criminal enterprise. This framing required the government's role in the production of the poison to remain invisible. For years, it did. There was a memo, written in January 1927, filed in the Treasury Department's internal correspondence. It describes exactly what was about to be decided, and who was asking them not to decide it. The official record is a closed loop. Everything connects, once you find the right door. On purpose. Those 2 words appear in the original source documents, not inadvertently, not as an unintended consequence. On purpose. On purpose. Those 2 words appear in the original source documents. Charles Norris was New York City's first chief medical examiner, appointed in 1918 when the city decided, for the first time, that death investigations should be handled by doctors instead of political appointees. He was a forensic pathologist trained in Germany. He believed in data. He kept records of everything. By 1923, Norris had noticed a pattern in the bodies coming through his morgue. The cause of death was consistent: methanol poisoning. The source was consistent: industrial alcohol, denatured by federal formula, diverted from manufacturing supply chains into the city's bootleg liquor market. And the volume was increasing. He began publishing his findings, not as accusations, as data. Cause of death, chemical concentration, source alcohol type, date, case number. The forensic record of what was happening in New York City, documented body by body, published in the city's public health reports. By 1926, he had a number. He signed the form anyway. Approximately 1,200 people had died in New York City from government formula alcohol since the denaturation program began. Nationwide, his colleagues estimated the figure was 10 times higher. Norris called a press conference. He used a specific word to describe federal policy. He called it our national experiment in extermination. The New York Times covered it. The Washington Post covered it. The story ran in major papers across the country. The Prohibition Bureau's response was not to deny the figure. It was to issue an internal memo, the January 1927 document referenced in the Treasury Department's correspondence, that discussed the public criticism and concluded, the denaturation formula should not be softened. If anything, stricter enforcement of the existing formula was required. Some Bureau officials argued for raising the methanol minimum. They argued for it in writing. That document exists. It is held at the National Archives, under the records of the Bureau of Prohibition, Record Group 56. Deborah Blum accessed it for her 2010 book, The Poisoner's Handbook, which cross-referenced it with Norris's own case files. The Bureau's position was, in its own internal language, that reducing the denaturant formula would invite diversion, and that the public health consequences of reduced enforcement were an acceptable externality of the denaturation program. Acceptable externality. That is the phrase used for the deaths of American citizens. The formula was not changed. In 1927, reported deaths from denatured alcohol in New York City alone reached 700 for the year. That number does not count the blind. It does not count the people who survived with permanent neurological damage. It counts only the ones whose bodies ended up in the morgue with a case file that Norris had the resources to open. The number that broke everything was not 700. It was 11. The document didn't just exist. It was read, signed, filed, and then buried under 13 more years of policy. 11 was the number of chemical compounds in the denaturing formula approved by the Treasury Department in 1927, after Norris's press conference, after the newspaper coverage, after the documented deaths. 11. Before Norris went public, the standard formula required 4 denaturants. After the public pressure, the Bureau reviewed the formula and added 7 more. The 1927 formula, documented in the Federal Register and cross-referenced by Bloom against Treasury Department correspondence, included methanol, benzene, kerosene, brucine, gasoline, chloroform, carbon tetrachloride, camphor, nicotine sulfate, acetone, and formaldehyde. Formaldehyde. In a bottle people were drinking from. This was not an accident of regulatory inertia. The expansion of the formula happened in direct response to public attention. The Bureau's documented reasoning was that if the existing formula was generating press coverage, the solution was a more effective formula, not a less lethal one. The government's answer to being caught poisoning people was to poison them more thoroughly. And this is where it gets interesting, because the government's own lawyers knew this was a problem. In 1928, a federal attorney in the Southern District of New York prepared an internal brief on potential liability for the denaturation program. The brief concluded that, under existing tort law, the government's knowing authorization of a poison that caused foreseeable civilian deaths could, in theory, constitute a basis for legal action. The brief was classified. It remained classified until the 1990s. What the brief reveals, beyond the liability concern, is that someone inside the federal legal apparatus understood in 1928 that what the government was doing had a name. The brief does not use the word murder. It uses foreseeable harm and deliberate risk creation. But the logic is the same. The government knew the formula was lethal. It knew civilians were consuming the product. It chose to expand the formula. And its own lawyers quietly wrote down that this might be a problem, then filed it somewhere no one would look for 70 years. Here is what Charles Norris did with this information. He kept publishing. In 1929, he published a comprehensive report through the New York City Department of Health. It included names, not aggregate statistics, names, individual case files, men who went blind on New Year's Eve, women who died in January of what their families were told was heart failure, workers who collapsed in their apartments 3 days after a holiday party. He attached chemical analysis to each death certificate. He named the source compound. He named the federal formula it came from. He sent the report to the Treasury Department. He sent it to the Prohibition Bureau. He sent it to the office of the president. The response from the Prohibition Bureau was a letter, preserved at the National Archives, informing Norris that his report contained unsubstantiated allegations regarding federal policy and that his characterization of the denaturation program was inconsistent with the public health objectives of the Volstead Act. They told the chief medical examiner of New York City that his autopsy findings were unsubstantiated. He had opened the bodies himself. Norris held another press conference. He read the Bureau's letter aloud. Then he read the case files. He did not editorialize. He did not call for anyone to resign. He read the names, the dates, the compounds, and the concentrations. He read the federal formula. He read the expansion memo. He read the Bureau's letter calling it unsubstantiated. He let the documents sit next to each other in front of reporters and said nothing else. The New York Times ran the story on page 1. The Prohibition Bureau did not change the formula. Norris died in 1935, 2 years after Prohibition ended, still the chief medical examiner of New York City. The cause of death in his case file is listed as overwork. He had spent 12 years documenting what his government was doing to the people it governed. He had the evidence. Nobody was ever charged. The formula was discontinued in 1933. The reasoning was never revised. Prohibition ended in December 1933. The official history closes the chapter there. The 18th Amendment was a mistake. The 21st corrected it. The country moved on. What the official history does not close is the question of institutional accountability, because there was none. Not a single Prohibition Bureau official was prosecuted for the denaturation program. Not one internal memo was declassified in response to Norris's reports. The January 1927 expansion memo, the document that authorized more poison after the deaths became public, was filed, archived, and forgotten. It surfaced in the 1990s when researchers began systematically accessing the National Archives records of the Bureau of Prohibition under FOIA. The mechanism that allowed this to happen has a formal name in public policy literature: regulatory capture. It describes the condition in which a regulatory agency comes to serve the interests of the industry or ideology it was created to regulate, rather than the public it was created to protect. The Prohibition Bureau was not captured by industry. It was captured by its own mission, by the moral logic of prohibition itself, which held that anyone who consumed illegal alcohol had forfeited their claim to state protection. If you drink something illegal and it kills you, that is your fault. This logic is not extinct. It reappears in every institutional scandal, where the state must decide whether to protect people from a foreseeable harm it helped create. It appeared in the Tuskegee syphilis study, where doctors withheld penicillin from men who had syphilis because treating them would have ended the experiment. It appeared in the response to the opioid crisis, where the FDA's approval of OxyContin in 1995 was processed by a reviewer who was later hired by Purdue Pharma. It appears whenever an institution decides that the people being harmed are, by definition, the kind of people who deserve to be harmed. The government did not poison 10,000 Americans because it was indifferent to their deaths. It poisoned them because it had decided their deaths were, in the language of the 1927 memo, an acceptable externality. That phrase has never been retracted. The question worth sitting with is not whether this could happen again. The question is, who, right now, is writing the memo? The records are open. The names are there. The memos are there. What's missing is the follow-through. Charles Norris opened thousands of bodies over 12 years. He knew what killed each one. He wrote it down. He published it. He said the name of the institution responsible. And the institution outlasted him. That is not a story about prohibition. That is a story about what institutions do when the evidence contradicts the policy. They do not change the policy. They reclassify the evidence. They question the credentials of the person presenting it. They file the uncomfortable memo where no one will look for 70 years. The Prohibition Bureau was dismantled in 1933. Its logic was not. If a government program killed 10,000 of its own citizens, deliberately, with documented intent, and no one was held accountable, what does that tell you about accountability? And if the answer to that question was buried in the National Archives for 60 years, what else is currently waiting to be found? Tell me in the comments, which institution do you think is writing the acceptable externality memo right now? Next week, we open a case that was never supposed to be a case at all, and find the signature of someone who should not have been there. The record is always there. Someone always has to be willing to read it.